Raging Abe Simpson and his Grumbling Grandson and the Cursed Flying Hellfish is, in my opinion, the most underrated episode of The Simpsons. It's not that it received a negative response or anything, but most of the reviews are generally praising, and with good reason. Cinematography, the light and the colour palette, this episode is gorgeous, and stylized to high heaven. Personally, if I was judging Simpson episodes purely on their overall visual style, I would consider it only having 2 episodes as direct competition. From an aesthetic point of view, this episode should be up there as one of the show's hard hitters, so why isn't it regarded as one of the all-time greats? From what I've been able to find, this episode is lucky to get even an honourable mention on most top lists, and that's if it receives any acknowledgements at all, which 9 times out of 10, it doesn't. So the visual style isn't the problem. Maybe the substance of the episode itself just isn't up to par. And to that I say, let me take you to church. The plot of this episode went put simply is Abe and Burns part of the same war squad, the Flying Hellfish, in World War II, during which they stumbled upon some stolen paintings. The squad agrees to a dong team, which means that the last surviving member of the squad will get the paintings. The episode takes place just after Razor Phelps, the third to last surviving member, passes away, leaving Abe and Burns as the only 2 left in the running, leading to what is essentially Burns trying to kill Abe or to a lesser extent get his key for nearly 22 minutes. However, this episode's main focus, in my opinion, is on Abe's relationship with his grandson, Bort, and seeks to develop Bort's perception of his grandpa from being embarrassed by his outbursts and crazy stories to valuing those stories and realising, while not everything his grandpa says is gospel, can appreciate him and see him for the accomplished man that he is. This is set up well with the episode's opening scene, which showcases a grandparents' day plot point where Bart is understandably embarrassed by his grandfather's actions and ranting in front of his classmates and teacher. This episode's narrative is one of the most engaging and intriguing that I've personally seen from The Simpsons. We get to learn a little of Grandpa's history and deep-seated rivalry with Burns. This allows us to explore sides of the characters that we haven't gotten a glimpse properly until now. We get to see arguably the darkest side of Burns so far, with the episode showing just how far he is willing to go to get what he wants. The rivalry between Abe and Burns is well established in both tone and rank from the very first encounter the 2 share in this episode, at fallen member Razor Phelps' funeral. I'm always blown away by how natural this dynamic feels. This scene alone makes me completely buy into the fact that Grandpa and Burns have this history, and have been at each other's throats all these years. It also establishes the hierarchy of the episode, with Burns being treated with a seriousness that helps us buy into the looming threat that he poses, and with Grandpa being treated as a bit of a joke, placing Burns firmly in the power seat for the majority of the episode. After the first 5 minutes, we have not only established the plot, history and stakes of the episode, but also clearly defined where each character stands in relation to one another, and allowing us as an audience to appreciate the development that each undergoes. The episode then places its following scenes very well. We have the assassination attempts, which, believe it or not, help to inject a little bit of humour into the episode, while also conveying to us the very real danger that Grandpa is in. The tonal shifts between Burns hiring an assassin and the gruesome scale of these murder attempts, countered by the hilarious outcomes that result from their failures, never failed to impress me. Abe retreats to the Simpson household, and what follows is a flashback storytime scene that, while it's mainly set on a battlefield, is slower and more relaxed in pace, contrasting nicely with the previous scene, and giving the audience a nice breather before the mile-a-minute thrill ride that is this episode's 3rd act. These flashback sequences being told through narrated flashback stories to Bort are very nicely done. These flashbacks are interesting, well-paced, and beautifully stylized. The episode transitions well, going from a somber funeral scene to several violent assassination attempts to Grandpa recounting tales of old to his grandson to Mr. Burns smashing through the wall with a fucking crane! It should honestly feel more jarring than it does. I also have to say that the twisting of the keys into the vault might be one of the most satisfying sound effects I've heard in the show. Also, did I mention the music in this episode is fantastic? This episode's use of lighting is my favourite in the show's entire run, and helps to make for iconic frame after iconic frame. I adore how ham they go with Mr. Burns as the villain in this, and I don't mean ham necessarily as an over-the-top performance, I mean ham as in making this boy off the fucking rails in terms of his actions. Burns gives no fucks this episode. He tries to have Grandpa killed, points a gun at a 10-year-old and kicks him into a large box, which proceeds to sink underwater before joyfully saying to Abe that he will see him at the reunion in November with no regard or acknowledgement for what he's just done, leading to an intense climax with beautiful lighting, pacing, intensity, and with a narrative that makes you firmly invested in its outcome. I won't go into the climax too much, as I feel it's very much a treat that you need to experience. However, I can't ignore it completely if I want to explore the conclusion of this episode's narrative and character arcs. Abe has had enough. That sergeant deeply embedded with him comes out, allowing him to rescue Bort and chase down Burns. This is, in my opinion, possibly the best chase sequence the show has ever produced in both pacing and visual prowess. Grandpa's done. Look at that face. Burns gonna die. The chase sequence ends with Burns on the floor looking up at Grandpa, who is now in the position of power out of the 2, as the frame establishes having him looking down at Burns and refusing to stoop to his level, instead dismissing him and telling him to get out of his sight. The 3rd act of this episode is so intense and engaging, it feels like it could be the 3rd act of an action movie. It's thrilling, it's gorgeous, the music, it's got suspense, and it's got the funny. We have Grandpa stealing Flanders' boat, to which he joyfully complies. Grandpa having Bart pull on the rope 63 times for out of air and 64 times to pull me back up. And Smithers abandoning ship. This episode's got the funny. All of this leads to Abe and his grandson defeating the big bad and ends with him dismissing Burns, giving a satisfying close to the rivalry and stakes of the episode. before ending with what the episode set up at the very start. Bart acknowledging his grandpa with a newfound respect, and the two hug, ending the episode on a sweet and wholesome note. Oh yeah, and this guy calls him gay. What this episode treats us to above all else is to finally give Grandpa what he was due. We finally get to see the hard-as-nails sergeant he was in his army days, the love he has for his grandson, and when it really counts he can see the day through to the end and come out on top. For me, this episode took Grandpa from a top 25 character at best and placed him firmly in my top 15, and every time I rewatch this episode he gets a fair few days in my top 10. So why don't people rave about this one? If it's not for the style or substance, could it really be something as simple as the title being too long? I've heard some people complain about how the ending feels like none of the Simpsons can get rich cop-out, when the paintings are ultimately taken, but the paintings were a plot device, nothing more. It was never about the paintings, it was about the friendships we made along the way. One common criticism I've heard from those who've talked about this episode in the past is that it lacks in the joke department. And to that I say, excuse me what? Yes, this episode isn't exactly a laugh per second, but the jokes it does deliver, it really delivers. The assassin, talking about the intricacies and subtleties of his plan only to burst into the retirement home with a machine gun and open fire, gets me every time. The nurse at the retirement home having a more powerful firearm on hand that she viciously fires in retaliation. Burns and Smithers dressed as the Simpson family. The family's lack of acknowledgement to Grandpa banging at the door. In fact, the ending joke of this episode is one of the series' most quoted. It's not one of my personal favourite lines, but hey, I'm taking what I can get here. Mr. Burns attempting to exit in a villainous style only to crash into Lisa's room and is mistaken for Santa by a half-awake Lisa. Homer showing interest in joining Grandpa and Bart only to pass the second effort on his part as implied to be needed. And several more in the third act that I've already discussed. I completely agree that this episode is very much story and characters first, joke second. However, all I'm trying to say is it's not as much of a distant second as many would lead you to believe. But hey, what good's my word, right? The only word that matters is yours, your words. That's the beauty of subjectivity. No one gives a fuck. Maybe this episode's a solid 6 and I've wasted your time, but I firmly believe that to not be the case. I proudly rate this as my third favourite episode in the show's entire run. And if that isn't a convincing enough recommendation, I also just think it's neat. Now, even though I've just described most of this episode to the point where it may feel like you've seen it already, watch it. I hope you enjoyed this video and let me know of any of the Simpson episodes that you think people underrate. Also, if you guys want to have your minds absolutely blown, check out the Real Jim's Who Shot Mr. Burns series. If you're a fan of this episode, part 4 in particular will become your new favourite thing. See you next time.
Bart's people just think our veterans deserve a little recognition. If I'm guilty of anything, maybe it's caring too much. I'm Bart Simpson.